In 1976, Patricia Lawson, a beloved 22-year-old mail carrier in rural Granville, Ohio, vanished without a trace during her routine morning delivery route. But 17 years later, a farmer's irrigation project would unearth something that would shock the whole community. The October morning mist clung to the cornfields surrounding Granville like a shroud, the kind of fog that made headlights necessary even after sunrise. Detective Elizabeth Lawson stood at the edge of Earl Hutchinson's property, her breath visible in the crisp air as she surveyed the scene that had haunted her dreams for weeks. At 25, she was Granville's first female police chief, having returned from her detective work in Columbus with a singular mission. The skeletal remains discovered here 3 months ago weren't just another cold case. They belonged to her sister Patricia, who had disappeared when Elizabeth was only 8 years old. Now, with the authority she'd spent her entire career building toward, she finally had the power to uncover the truth that had eluded everyone for nearly 2 decades. October 14, 1976, had started like any other day for Patricia Lawson. At 7:30 a.m., she loaded her mail truck at the Granville post office, chatting cheerfully with Postmaster Harold Miller about her weekend plans to visit their family's cabin by Round Lake. Patricia was known throughout the community for her reliability and warm smile, never missing a day on her 15-mile rural route that wound through the countryside's narrow gravel roads. She was particularly excited that morning, having just gotten engaged to her high school sweetheart, David Morrison, and was eager to share the news with the elderly farmers and families along her route who had become like extended family to her. But Patricia never made it to her first delivery. By noon, when she failed to return for her lunch break, Postmaster Miller grew concerned. At 2:30 p.m., a passing motorist discovered her mail truck abandoned on Overton Road, its doors flung open and mail scattered across the gravel like confetti. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine running, and Patricia's purse sat untouched on the passenger seat. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened to the young woman who had simply vanished into the autumn air. The investigation that followed consumed Granville for months. Sheriff Oliver Johnson, a 30-year veteran of law enforcement, coordinated search parties that combed every inch of the surrounding countryside. Bloodhounds tracked Patricia's scent to a point 50 yards from the truck before losing the trail completely. The FBI was called in, interviewing everyone who knew Patricia, from her fiancé David to the customers on her mail route. Theories ranged from kidnapping to a voluntary disappearance, though those who knew Patricia's character dismissed the latter immediately. The Lawson family was devastated. Patricia's parents, Robert and Mary, aged visibly during the weeks of fruitless searching, while 8-year-old Elizabeth couldn't understand why her beloved big sister had simply disappeared. The community rallied around the family, organizing fundraisers and search parties, but as weeks turned to months with no leads, the case gradually faded from daily conversation. Sheriff Johnson kept the file open, following up on occasional tips and sightings, but Patricia Lawson had seemingly vanished from the earth. 17 years passed before Patricia's fate was revealed. Earl Hutchinson, a third-generation farmer whose cornfields bordered Overton Road, had decided to install a new irrigation system in the spring of 1993. The project required deep trenching across his property, and on a warm May afternoon, his excavator struck something that shouldn't have been there. At first, he thought it was just an old hay tarp, but as he brushed away the dirt, Earl found himself staring at a deteriorated mailbag bearing the U.S. Postal Service logo. Inside were letters postmarked October 14, 1976, Patricia's final delivery route. But it was what lay beneath the mailbag that sent Earl scrambling to call the authorities. Human skeletal remains, buried 4 feet deep in the rich Ohio soil. The discovery sent shockwaves through Granville. The remains were quickly identified through dental records as Patricia Lawson, but the location raised immediate questions. The burial site was only 200 yards from where her mail truck had been found, yet the area had been thoroughly searched in 1976. More disturbing was the condition of the skull, which showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma, a devastating blow that was inconsistent with any accident. The forensic pathologist determined that Patricia had died from this single, powerful impact, and the careful burial suggested someone had deliberately concealed her body. Elizabeth, now a seasoned detective with the Columbus Police Department, requested immediate transfer back to Granville. The case that had shaped her entire life was finally getting the attention it deserved, and she was determined to find answers. Working closely with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, she began re-examining every piece of evidence from the original investigation, interviewing witnesses who were still alive, and following leads that had been overlooked or dismissed decades earlier. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Whitmore, the elderly widow of Granville's longtime mayor, was dying of cancer and requested to speak with Elizabeth privately. What she revealed in her hospital bed would shatter the community's understanding of Patricia's disappearance and expose a conspiracy that had protected the guilty for nearly 2 decades. On the morning of October 14, 1976, Mayor Richard Whitmore's 19-year-old son, James, had been driving recklessly through the countryside after a night of heavy drinking. James, fresh from his expulsion from Ohio State University for academic and behavioral problems, had been a source of constant worry for his prominent family. That fateful morning, speeding down Overton Road in his father's Cadillac, James had struck Patricia's mail truck as she was loading mail into roadside boxes. The impact sent Patricia flying, her head striking a large rock with fatal force. Terrified and still intoxicated, James called his father rather than the police. Mayor Whitmore, facing re-election and knowing that his son's actions would destroy their family's political dynasty, made a decision that would haunt Granville for decades. Together with his brother Thomas, the town's longtime sheriff's deputy, they moved Patricia's body to Earl Hutchinson's cornfield and buried her along with her mailbag. They then returned to stage the scene, opening the truck doors and scattering mail to suggest an abduction. But Margaret's deathbed confession revealed an even more disturbing truth. Sheriff Oliver Johnson, the man who had led the investigation into Patricia's disappearance, had not been the dedicated lawman he appeared to be. Johnson had been at the scene that morning, having been called by Mayor Whitmore immediately after the accident. Rather than arresting James Whitmore or properly investigating the crime, Johnson had actively participated in the cover-up, using his position to misdirect the FBI investigation and suppress any evidence that might have led to the truth. The conspiracy went deeper than anyone had imagined. Johnson had spent the next 17 years knowing exactly what had happened to Patricia Lawson while comforting her grieving family and accepting their gratitude for his tireless efforts to find their daughter. He had attended Patricia's memorial service, looked her parents in the eye, and lied about his dedication to solving the case. The man who should have been Patricia's greatest advocate had instead been her greatest betrayer. James Whitmore, now 36 and living in California under an assumed name, was arrested and charged with vehicular manslaughter and conspiracy to conceal a crime. His father, the former mayor, had died in 1988, taking most of the conspiracy to his grave. Sheriff Johnson and Deputy Thomas, both long retired, faced charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy, though advanced age and declining health of Johnson made prosecution challenging. The revelation destroyed the Whitmore family's legacy in Granville. Streets and buildings bearing their name were renamed, and their charitable foundation was dissolved. The community struggled to reconcile the family they had respected for generations with the shocking truth of their crimes. For Elizabeth, the resolution brought a complex mix of emotions. The answer she had sought her entire life had finally come, but it revealed a betrayal that cut to the heart of everything she had believed about justice and her community. Standing in the cemetery where Patricia was finally laid to rest properly, surrounded by family and friends who had never stopped loving her, Elizabeth felt the weight of 2 decades of questions finally lifting from her shoulders. Patricia's case became a catalyst for police reform in Granville and surrounding counties. Elizabeth used her position as police chief to implement new protocols for evidence handling and investigation procedures, ensuring that no family would ever again be betrayed by those sworn to protect them. The truth had taken 17 years to surface, but Patricia Lawson's legacy would be measured not in the corruption that took her life, but in the justice reforms that would protect others in her memory. In the end, Patricia's disappearance had revealed not just the circumstances of her death, but the price of power without accountability and the courage required to confront uncomfortable truths. Her story served as a reminder that in small communities where everyone knows everyone, the most dangerous secrets are often hidden in plain sight, protected by those who should be the first to expose them.